Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Welcome to the 7th in a series of Redux reviews, where I revisit my earlier videos that were recorded a few years ago on substandard equipment and with less in the way of production values. The aim of these reviews is to enable me to tighten and expand the writing, fleshing out with further insight where appropriate, and to produce something of superior video and audio quality to the original. Today's retro review is the 2002 supplement Dwarfs, Stone and Steel for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay by Hogshead Publishing. Okay, first a bit of history. Dwarfs, Stone and Steel is a 112-page softback book that I was surprised to discover was actually the final published book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition. It was produced by Hogshead Publishing under license from Games Workshop. Right to the cover. Here we have an excellent piece by industry and indeed Warhammer alumni Ralph Horsley that is fairly reminiscent of the original Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay rulebook. To the inside. Once we get past the credits and contents pages, we come to Chapter 1, which is entitled History of the Dwarf Race, and this gives us a potted history that stretches from the time of the Ancestor Gods to the coming of Chaos and the Golden Age, which includes the War of Vengeance, and the Goblin Wars, the Great Schism, the coming of the Manlings, and the rise of Sigmar, and also the Age of Heroes, finishing at the current age where it talks about where the dwarves of today are. Chapter 2 is about Dwarf Society. This covers everything from social values shared by dwarves and the social structure and the life cycle of dwarves right the way from infancy through their youth, adulthood, full beards, long beards, elders, great beards and living ancestors. Interestingly, dwarves usually live for around 200 years, but can be known to live for far longer. For example, we are told of the great runesmith Crag the Grim, who lived until he was 1,620 years old, driven by the need for vengeance. Importantly, we also get information on dwarf women. It talks about the fact that though they carry their father's name as part of their surname, dwarf clans are matrilineal and they are considered to belong to the same clan as their mothers. Dwarf women wield a considerable amount of power in Dwarf Society and have a tendency to live longer than the males. The eldest female member of a dwarf clan, the Matriarch, is always the chair of the Elder Council, acting as a moderator, mirroring the role of Valya after Grunny's departure, though it is suspected that dwarf males do not like to squabble in front of a lady, and this helps to keep tempers in line. The only exception to this role is in the royal clans where the king holds supreme power, though the queen will always serve as their husband's chief advisor. Dwarf women are the principal teachers of young dwarves, rulers of households, and are entrusted with the fate of the dwarf race. They are trained to fight alongside dwarf males, though will most often stay within the safety of the dwarven hold. Dwarf males fight with greater tenacity when dwarf females are alongside them, as the very idea of them being captured or killed is an unthinkable disgrace. It covers courtship and marriage, and even answers the age-old question as to whether dwarf women have beards. Please note, they don't. We have information on Dwarf Anatomy, and it includes a section on their normal diet, and even covers the nutritional benefits of dwarf ale, and it goes on to talk about dwarf reproduction. This is something that is never discussed in polite company, and their fertility is considered low when compared to humans, though the longevity of the race mitigates this somewhat. It then goes on to discuss the various craft guilds associated with the dwarves. We have the usual armourers, weaponsmiths, engineers and miners, but it also points out that dwarfs make excellent healers, as they simply see the body as a machine that breaks down and that can be repaired, which is kind of obvious when you think about it. Additionally, we have information on what exists outside the guilds, things like the noble clans, the clergy, lawmasters, and perhaps most importantly the slayers, which goes into the dwarf mindset and discusses troll, giant, dragon and demon slayers. It gives us a table of the dwarf calendar and discusses the various important dates, and we have a small section on dwarf friends and grudges. It details the animosity that they feel toward elves and the hatred they feel for the greenskins. Disappointingly, chaos dwarves, known to dwarves as the Tainted, are only mentioned in passing. The next chapter is called Dwarf Holds. This details Karaz-Ankor, the dwarf empire, beginning with the capital, Everpeak, or as it is properly known, Karaz-Akarak. With a population of around 350,000 dwarfs living comfortably, it is a fortress so formidable that its rune-inscribed gates have withstood countless attempts at being breached, and it is home to the High King. Deeper than Everpeak, there is Runic and Ankor, or the Rune Master's Lair, that is said to be ruled by the ancient Master Rune Lord Crag the Grim, and a place where many dwarfs come to learn from the greatest living runesmith. He is known for sharing his wisdom with those dwarves who are willing, and he is held in the highest regard by the High King. Many dwarf guilds are resident here, with the Engineers Guild designing and creating many complex engines of war, such as gyrocopters and flame cannons. Entry into their complex is denied to all outsiders, bar engineers from other holds. The master brewer, Hark Shorehand, brews his deep red ale of plenty here that is so nutritious that it can sustain a dwarf through a winter of fasting, though Hark's special brew is thought to be his greatest creation. Non-dwarves can be rendered unconscious by this blackish ale. Caracadron's renowned jewelsmiths also work here, and their creations are so exquisite that even lesser works demand the highest of prices. The mines underneath Caracadron go deeper than the roots of the earth and continue to yield ore, gems and precious metals. In addition to this, the underway from here to Zufbar has been restored, though the way is plagued by trouble at some points, and many troll slayers patrol these areas with heavily armed guards. It then goes on to detail major holds like Zufbar, a fortress situated in a deep-sided canyon which is a centre for dwarf engineers who use the power from the Blackwater waterfall to turn thousands of water wheels, with the sound of rushing water and dwarf machinery filling the air. Zufbar engineers are considered a bit more adventurous and innovative than those at Caracadron. It is ruled by King Morgrim Ironforge and his wife, Queen Lenka. It is under constant threat from greenskins above ground and Skaven below, and this has forged the mentality of those that live here. The underway can be reached from here via the Grimbar Gate, a huge iron thing protected by powerful runes that can only be opened with keys held by the King, the Queen, the Gatekeeper and the Engineer's Guildmaster. It glows red when orcs and goblins come close. The dwarfs here have sealed off all of the tunnels to Caracadron, and it is frequently patrolled for Skaven invaders. Caracadron, or the Stronghold of the Pass, is next, and it is the largest of the northern holds after Caracadron. It is also nicknamed the Slayer Keep due to King Ungrim Ironfist, a direct descendant of King Baragor who took the Slayer oath centuries ago. His duties as king prevented him from finding redemption in a heroic death, so this burden has been passed down his bloodline. Baragor founded a great shrine to Grimnir, the Slayer god, and all Slayers are welcome in his realm. King Ungrim honours his oath by waging constant war against the enemies of the dwarves, and he is regarded as the greatest living general in Karazankor. Caracadron has never fallen, and its proximity to Kislev has forged relationships between the dwarves and humans, whom they trade with, and they can count on each other for assistance against the orcs, goblins, Skaven and beastmen. The population of Slayers has allowed Caracadron to repulse many attacks, even in the absence of King Ungrim and the resident army. There is a blocked and heavily guarded entrance to the underway here, and this portion of it is known to be rife with dangerous enemies. Parties of Slayers set out along the underway, often to patrol it, and it has never been breached underground, and their rich deposits of ores and gems make it one of the wealthier holds. Next it talks about Carrack 8 Peaks. During the Golden Age, it was considered the most important of the southern holds, with its incredible architecture giving it the name Valya Azralungal, or Queen of the Silver Depths. Built in a colossal natural amphitheatre, it is encircled by 8 snow-capped peaks, with only one mountain track leading here from Death Pass. Around 3,200 years ago, dwarf miners mistakenly broke into Skaven tunnels, which caused them to begin incursions into the mines, while being under siege by the orcs and goblins above ground. Realising that they would eventually be overrun, the dwarfs here sealed up the shrines to their ancestors, gathered up what they could, and led by King Lun, broke through the orc and goblin lines and fled to Caracadron. Over the next few centuries, the Skaven, orcs and goblins fought amongst each other over the place, but none of them could ever gain a foothold, so both retreated, leaving the place abandoned. Over time, rumours of lost dwarf treasures spread across the land, and adventurers arrived here seeking their fortune. Around 40 years ago, Belgar Ironhammer of the Angrun clan and a descendant of King Lun set up camp here and declared himself king. Some of the ancestral treasures were recovered, but most attention was given to fixing the hold's defences. He knew that once word got out that the dwarfs had returned here, greenskins and ratmen would follow. Events went as predicted, with orcs and goblins laying siege for 25 years until a number of relief expeditions from Caracadron arrived and drove them back. Only a few thousand dwarves live here in a perpetual state of siege, and the mines remain sealed to prevent attacks from Skaven or worse from below. King Belagar and Queen Kemma still dream of returning Carrack 8 Peaks to its former glory, and refugees and expatriate dwarves are always welcomed here. Even a closely watched band of elves use the hold as a base for expeditions into the nearby mountains and caves. The underway to Caracadron has been reopened, though it is treacherous, with trolls occasionally making their way here. We then talk about Caracadron. A hold with spires of iron over stone walls, it occupies an entire plateau overlooking a valley. The volcanic Fire Mountain, or Caracadron, can be seen from the southern towers. It is ruled by King Cazador Thunderhorn, a mightily built dwarf even by their own standards, who in his early days used to demonstrate his strength by lifting pack mules loaded with gold and drinking his warriors under the table. These days he broods in loss. Many years ago, while on a hunt, the orc warlord Gorfang broke into his hold and he returned to find it ransacked, his wife Queen Morga missing, and his son Prince Kazrik shaved and nailed to the throne. Khazric left to take the Slayer's Oath, and Khazador has hardly left his chambers since. Due to its depleted population, Caracadron cannot raise an army large enough to assault Blackcrag to rescue the hostages, and he hopes for a small force to enter the Orc stronghold and rescue them. He offers half of his wealth to any dwarf who can do this, a third to any non-dwarf, and a quarter to any who can bring back their bodies for proper burial, as well as the pick of his treasures for anyone who can bring back the body of Gorfang. Many have attempted, but none have succeeded. Even though the king broods in darkness, Caracadron produces weapons of unrivaled quality that are traded along the underway, and it is a centre for metalwork. It then moves on to Barak Var, Seagate. This is the only dwarf hold built on the coast, and is a cosmopolitan city by dwarf standards. Ships from the likes of Araby and Cathay can be seen moored here, with trade routes running up the Skull River through to Karazakarak. This place is ruled by King Zamnil Grundason. His belief is that if the humans do not interfere with the security and trade of Barak Var, then he will be very accommodating. Anyone who causes harm will feel the wrath of the king. It is here that the small but very powerful dwarf naval fleet is moored, with their job being to keep the Black Gulf trade routes open. They have fought Skaven, orcs, goblins and bandits on the waves, and as such Barak Var has never been attacked by greenskins. The engineers of Clan Cragbrow reside here, with their fearsome ironclads and warships, though the upstart Steelhammer clan have developed submarines and clockwork torpedoes in recent years. The entrance to Barak Var's harbour is protected by immense iron gates, and the Sea Vultures, a squadron of gyrocopters, as well as long-barrelled cannon emplacement. After this it covers some of the other holds such as Caracadron or Hornhold, named so due to the way the wind catches the caverns here that sounds like a war horn. Carachizor or Copper Mountain, a hold with formidable defences that is ruled by King Kazran Grimbrow and Queen Astrid the Wise, and Caracadron or Barren Earth Hold, a place populated by the displaced of the former hold of Mount Silverspear that sits on the mineral and semi-precious stone deposits of the Grey Mountains. It is from here that the Dwarfs monitor the Wood Elves of Loren, though they have not been a threat for over 4,000 years. It follows this with details on the lost holds. We have some information on the likes of Carach Ungor, Carach Varn and Carach Asgal, as well as some information on the lost dwarf mines like Ekrund and Mount Gumbad. Following this, we have details on the expatriate dwarves from the various cities like Middenheim and Nuln, as well as dwarfs that live in different countries like Kislev and Bretonia. We then have a welcome section on Norse Dwarves, which details their settlements such as Cracadrak and Cracadorden. This is followed by the tale of the doom of Khazad-Grund, which tells the story of how the dwarf stronghold fell to the Greenskins, which is followed by a double-page spread detailing a blow-by-blow account of events. Chapter 4 is entitled Dwarf Technology. It talks about how the Dwarf Engineers Guild sets limits on their inventions, and how they are the most advanced race in the world. Their weapons and armour are unmatched, and their gunpowder technology is way ahead of everyone else. These advancements peaked during the Goblin Wars due to the dwarfs being greatly outnumbered, and the sophistication of their attack and defence was required to give them an edge. The main two inventions in recent times were gunpowder and steam engines, which fueled their advancement in the development of war machines. It begins with detailing the metal held most precious to dwarfs, Gromril. Dwarfs have figured out how to extract other mystical metals from Gromril, such as mithril and adamant. The chapter then goes on to give rule details on dwarf inventions such as the fire thrower and a swivel gun, personal weapons like the dwarf handgun and mortar, and onto heavier weapons like the breaker cannon, the organ gun and the thunder cannon. We have stats for gyrocopters and war balloons, and then it goes on to dwarf shipping. It goes into the stats for the various ships that dwarfs use, including the gunboat, monitor, ironclad, dreadnought and nautilus submersible. It also details the dwarf earth bore and mining drill, as well as some general notes on dwarf technology and how things are generally only built by the person who created them, with the odd exception like the ironclad or the war balloon. The next chapter, Magic, gives basic details on dwarf rune magic. It talks about dwarf runesmiths, as well as listing the rules around runic crafting or how to inscribe runes, and even talks about the anvils of doom. It goes into various runic forms, that being armour, engineering, protection, talismanic, weapon and special. It gives some basic rules on inscribing temporary runes, and then gives the rules of the runes. There's the rule of 3. No item can have more than 3 runes on it. The rule of form, that being that runes can only be inscribed on items that they can be used with, i.e. weapon runes on weapons. There's the odd exception, which is detailed in the rune description. There's the rule of pride, which means that no more than one item in a 100-yard radius can have the same combination of magic runes, with the runes becoming inert for all items for the duration. There's the rule of jealousy, which states that only one master rune can be inscribed on an item, and that no more than one item can have the same master rune within 100 yards, with the runes becoming inert for the duration otherwise. There is the rule of combination, whereby apart from master runes, other runes can be combined to produce varied or cumulative effects. There's the rule of dislike, whereby any attempt to inscribe a rune on an item created by sorcerous means will result in a 10-foot radius explosion. And finally the rule of disharmony, where it states that non-dwarves are not fully attuned to runic items, and therefore no matter how many items they carry, only the 3 lowest level runes are active as determined by the GM. It talks about the amount of magic points gained by runesmiths as they go up in level, and also how to learn master runes and what happens when a rune-inscribed object is broken. After this, it goes into some rune weapons of renown, including Sigmar's famous hammer, Galmaraz. The weapon is not statted out here, as are the other weapons, which is odd as Galmaraz is statted out fully in Empire in Flames. We also have a list of Thungni's runes. These are the most common crafted amongst runesmiths, and details things like the rune of enchantment, the rune of purification, and the rune of verminkill, and then it goes on to detail the master runes, those such as the rune of Chaosbane, the master rune of Vigour, and the master rune of Vitality, and this is followed by a double-page spread of all known runes, and then it goes into dwarf wizards and alchemists. Magic is generally viewed by dwarfs as unreliable, untrustworthy, and corrupting, whose risks far outweigh its benefits, and as such they are generally wary of wizards even when allies. Conversely, they believe that magic granted by the gods is as reliable and incorruptible as rune magic. Should the cleric begin to covet power, the dwarf gods will simply strip it away from them. Only expatriate dwarves can become wizards, with even those being suspicious of other dwarves who are wizards. They can only learn the mystical arts from human masters, and with their mindset being the way it is, they always seek out tutelage on a one-to-one basis, as the idea of colleges is fairly alien to them. They generally have little aptitude with magic when compared to humans and elves, and lean towards battle magic as it is the simplest to master. They don't grasp or even care for colour magic, and ultimately they just don't see battle magic as being tainted by elven influence. Indeed, even regarding the mighty elven wizard Teclis as a charlatan. Some dwarves will lean towards elementalism, usually fire or earth magic, and they look down their noses at illusionists, seeing them as dishonest and dishonourable. There are 2 kinds of Dwarf Alchemist, the non-magical type that is a member of the Dwarf Engineers Guild, those responsible for the development and manufacture of the various compounds that are used in dwarf weaponry. These have a long-standing tradition and mistrust magic as much as the next dwarf. Those dwarves trained by human alchemists are generally more forgiving of magic, though they would still hire a dwarf alchemist over a human if push came to shove. We then move on to Chapter 6, Dwarf Religion. Dwarves venerate their ancestors rather than usual gods. Their belief in their ancestor gods is that of being watched over, and their actions and achievements are being judged to determine if they have led a worthy life. The main 3 ancestor gods that are worshipped are Grunny, Valya, and Grimnir, who, according to dwarf lore, were born deep within the mountains and that the entire dwarf race descended from them. Gazal, the younger brother of the 3, protects the spirits of the clan ancestors, and other gods such as Smednir, Thungni and Morgrim tend to be restricted to specific clans. Religion is an integral part of not only Dwarf Society but of also Dwarf Psyche, as it transcends the bounds dictated by clan and sometimes craft guild. Additionally, social functions such as marriage, judging within the law, consecration of new settlements, and conducting burial rites is something that religion is bound intrinsically to. Members of the clergy are held in high esteem, not only for their wisdom but also how they represent the ancestor gods, and they will often settle disputes between clans through their unbiased mediation. It gives a list of dwarf cleric skills here, and then goes on to discuss the main ancestor gods. First up is Grunny, the god of mining and stonework. He is the principal deity of the dwarf pantheon, and is created with teaching dwarfs the skills that they are most famed for, and also creating some of the most powerful artefacts ever created, such as the Throne of Power. It is said that he foresaw the coming of chaos and led his people to the safety of the earth, bringing them forward to battle chaos for the sake of the old world. He is also the chief husband of Valya. He is portrayed as a male dwarf clad in chainmail with a forked iron grey beard down to his feet, usually with a miner's pick in his hand, which is also the holy symbol of his priests. When in his martial aspect, he is armed with his runic warhammer, Drongrundum, or Thunderhammer. His temples can be found in all major dwarf settlements. The cult is allied with the rest of the dwarf pantheon, as well as the cult of Sigmar, while also having a tolerant respect for the old faith and halfling cults. He is neutral towards all others except the elven pantheon, which it feels some antipathy towards, and hostile to the enemies of the dwarf race. The cult has a special spell called One with the Stone, which grants the caster the ability to meld with stone and stone objects, gaining the power to pass through them. The next of the ancestor gods detailed is Valya, the goddess of home and healing. She is the wife of both Grunny and Grimnir, and the founder of many Dwarf Holds, and considered the protector of the dwarf race. She is credited as establishing dwarf culture and inventing their runic script. When Grunny prophesied the coming of chaos, Valya created a special rune that protects the dwarves and their shelters from the hostile warp matter. She is pictured as a typical dwarf woman with braided hair down to her feet, wearing chainmail and a purple gown, and carrying her rune axe Kradskonti, or Peacegiver. Her holy symbol is a shield with a runic representation of Ancestor Queen on the front. Her clerics wear purple robes trimmed with gold, and she is worshipped by dwarfs throughout the Old World and Norsca. All Dwarf Holds have temples to Valya, and these are normally located within or near the Queen's chambers, and also in every dwarf brewery. She is portrayed in two aspects in her temples, a peaceful one with an infant in one hand and a tankard of ale in the other, and the other is in a mail coat and helmet with axe and shield raised high. She essentially has the same alliances as Grunny's cult, with the addition that she is friendly with the cult of Rhea. Priests of Valya have access to battle magic and elemental spells as listed here. It also details Grimnir, the ancestor god of warriors. The brother of Grunny and husband of Valya, he is the patron of warriors, and more particularly, slayers. He is the warrior protector of the dwarfs, and slayers shave their heads, wear dyed mohawks and cover themselves in elaborate tattoos to honour Grimnir when he journeyed north to find the ruptured warp gate with his son Morgrim. He journeyed to the edge of the Chaos Wastes, where they fought the demon prince Caracadron in a battle that lasted 3 days. As he dealt the slaying blow, Grimnir ordered his son to return to take his place as protector of the dwarves, and what became of Grimnir is unknown, as dwarves do not speak of the matter. He is always portrayed as an archetype slayer armed with Asdroigadum, or War Axe of Doom, which is also his holy symbol. As you may imagine, Grimnir's priesthood emphasises combat skills and spells over all others. After Grimnir we have Gazul, the Lord of the Underearth. One of the lesser ancestor gods, Gazul, a clanless dwarf, established a tradition of ancestor veneration amongst his race. He also uncovered the signature runes that Grunny, Valya and Grimnir use that give their worshippers power over the elements. Gazul is pictured as a gloomy black-haired dwarf wearing armour and wielding the great rune sword Zarvengrin, or Flaming Vengeance. His holy symbol is a stylised cave entrance representing the Underearth where the ancestor spirits exist. There's also other aspects of Gazul where the symbol is the flame. This is used by the dwarf witch hunters of the Order of Guardians. All Dwarf Holds have a temple to Gazul, which is always adjacent to the burial vault underground, with huge statues of Gazul guarding the entrance. Gazul is allied with the other dwarf gods and on friendly terms with the cult of Sigmar and Mor, and hostile towards the enemies of the dwarfs, and even more so against necromancers and the undead. Clerics of Gazul can use some necromancy spells, but need to be careful when doing this due to the tight strictures of their faith. They have a cult-specific spell called Retribution, which destroys or dissipates undead. It covers the lesser cult of Smednir, the god of metalwork and refining ore, brother of Thungni and son of Grunny and Valya, who is said to have taught his younger brother the art of craftsmanship. He is often portrayed bare-armed and muscled, wearing a leather apron and his beard braided and tossed over his shoulder, wielding his rune hammer as Ullacrid or metal crafter. His symbol is an anvil, and his temples are usually in the workshop areas. After this we move on to Thungni, the god of runesmiths. The youngest of Grunny and Valya's sons, Thungni is the god of runic magic and runesmithing. During the migration, he is said to have journeyed deep into the earth and spent time in a place called Anchor Bryn, the Glittering Realm. He emerged from this place with the secrets of rune magic which he brought to the dwarves. He discovered that the ability to inscribe runic magic was not for everyone, with only his father Grunny and a few of his descendants having this gift. Thungni is said to have crafted some of the most powerful rune weapons ever created, and though some of them have become lost over the ages, many have remained in the possession of dwarf kings and rune lords. He's portrayed with reddish-brown hair and full armour inscribed with his personal rune, with a runic staff in one hand and the other wielding the runic hammer Caracadron, or Enduring War Rune. He has no formal temples, though the work halls of runesmiths always have shrines to him. The final god detailed is Morgrim, the god of engineers. The eldest son of Grimnir and Valya, Morgrim was the first dwarf engineer. He developed and taught his techniques to the dwarf clans, creating engines of war, intricate traps and many other things. As previously mentioned, Morgrim accompanied his father Grimnir on his quest to close the warp gate and honoured his father's request to return to his people. When the forces of chaos were contained in the north, he returned to the depths of the earth to join the other ancestor gods. He is depicted as a mail-clad dwarf wearing a tool belt. He has dust in his hair and beard and oil on his hands, and carries one of his father's axes on a Grunny or Widowmaker. He has 2 holy symbols, a stylised stone thrower and a rope and pulley. All Engineers Guild Hordes have a shrine to Morgrim, with the largest being in Zufbar. The last thing detailed here is the Ancestor Cults. For some dwarves, the ancestors are so intrinsic to their daily life that they are worshipped as a whole, and they believe that nothing should be undertaken without performing the proper rituals to solicit a blessing from their ancestors. These rituals are clan-specific, and dwarfs are taught them from early childhood. These cults are on friendly terms with other dwarf cults and have little to do with other races. The chapter that follows is Dwarf Characteristics, which starts with a naming table for both male and female dwarves, as well as discussing how their names are structured, i.e. being based on the name of their parents, as well as the tradition that dwarves gain nicknames for outstanding deeds or interesting personality quirks. It also talks about the clan names and provides some modified basic career tables. There is also a table for players to randomly generate their dwarf's origin, including which settlement they came from. We have some new dwarf basic careers, including the dwarf version of Alchemist, the Lore Master, and also Dragon and Demon Slayers, and Veteran Warriors. We also have a collection of new dwarf skills, with things like Arcane Language, Arcane Runic, Immunity to Fear, Immunity to Terror, and perhaps surprisingly, Ski. And this is followed by a small section on generating a family background and some notes on how to roleplay a dwarf. Chapter 8 details a few dwarfs of renown. Here we have statistics for such luminaries as the High King of the Dwarves, Thorgrim Grudgebearer, and Joseph Bugman, the famous Master Brewer. The final chapter is entitled Cassalad and Runic Script. Here we have a fairly extensive list on commonly used dwarf runes and an explanation on the roots of the dwarf language, as well as compiling a list of dwarf words and their closest human tongue equivalent. Finally, we have a timeline from around -2000 years ago, when the Ancestor gods began their colonisation of the World's Edge Mountains, up to the present day of 5510 or 2510 in the Imperial calendar, with Ungrim Ironfist defeating the Orcs in the Battle of Broken Leg Gully. Lastly, there is a dwarf glossary with some words and phrases that are commonly used, and also a gazetteer of the dwarf realms. Back in 2016, when I originally reviewed this book, I felt that it was generally good throughout, with a few niggles that soured the experience. I believe that this coloured the amount of time that I gave it, as in all honesty, when I look back at the original video, it felt like it was skimmed. My first issue was with the internal artwork. With the reused artwork aside, I felt a lot of the pictures are just too dark, and you just can't make out what's happening on some of them, which is something I still think to this day. The other thing I had issue with is that there is just not enough about what is left out. Runesmiths are covered in a basic manner, but there are too many refer to realms of sorcery or refer to Apocrypha now instructions throughout, which I still believe is true. I remember appreciating that the career path for Dragon Slayers and Demon Slayers were included, but felt the Slayers were one of the shining beacons of interest about dwarves in Warhammer, something I continue to believe to this day. Nobody ever made dwarves as interesting as Warhammer did, but unfortunately things like Slayers and the Book of Grudges were superficially covered or hardly talked about. Indeed, I believe you could make an entire book on Slayers. And although Chaos Dwarves are mentioned, it's only in passing and it's the only treatment that they get. I remember thinking that in every other way the dwarves described here could pretty much have come from any other role-playing system. They dislike elves, hate orcs, love gold, and are very proud, etc, etc, etc. And I would have liked more of a celebration of what makes Warhammer dwarves great, and it would also have been nice to have things like deck plans to the dwarf ships, as well as diagrams of the various weapons and gyrocopters. I think on reflection I was perhaps a tad unfair to Dwarf Stone and Steel. To date, it is probably the best book produced about Warhammer dwarves, and actually does contain a fair chunk of gameable material. The history of the dwarves is interesting and informative, and the dwarf inventions are excellent. There are many things missing, things like the Anvil of Doom is only mentioned in passing, and although runesmiths are more fully covered in realms of sorcery, I think a bit more could have been added here. That being said, there's a lot to like about this book. The potted history of the dwarf race is an interesting read, and the information on the various dwarf inventions is great, if incomplete. Also, the section on Cassalad remains really good. I originally said that the main problem here is that the book could have been triple the size and still held my interest if it contained the right topics, something I still think. It's my genuine hope that as dwarves are such a vital part of the old world, Cubicle 7 will update, expand and re-release Dwarf Stone and Steel for the latest edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I gave this book a 6.5 out of 10 in 2016, but on further reflection I felt it was a bit of a mean score, so I'm going to update that score to an 8 out of 10. If you enjoyed this review, please make sure to hit the thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos. Also, if you're interested in buying this product, I'll put some links below. Lastly, if you like what I produce here, then maybe think about supporting me on Patreon, or even becoming a member of my YouTube channel. Bud out.